So, by way of prequel, I had a lot of questions about what in the hell that title meant. I'm not actually talking about a specific game or a specific thing today as much as a methodology. So people were kind of confused. And so I wanted to start, before I get into the meat of the talk, with actually a little bit of a background as to why I chose the title I did. And really there were three different reasons. The first was the literal meaning. Information, stats, analytics, all the things, right? Like big data is everywhere now. So much of what you do every day is being monitored and recorded, and analyzing that data has become a major worldwide business. And as a designer, you need to be able to understand what it all means in order to use that data effectively in your maps and in your games. It's all relevant and it's all important. And the second reason is that it's a play on words with another talk I'm doing tomorrow called The Importance of Nothing. One is everything, one is nothing, haha, very funny. And I mentioned that not to boost attendance and get everybody to go, obviously you're all invited, but because in my talks with the GDC board when I was planning this talk, somehow that's the only talk in the entire main conference that is specifically about level design. And I've got to wonder how in the world that happens. Every one of you could have and should have submitted a talk. I saw a quote yesterday that said that everybody you meet knows something that you don't. And you have to understand that you are not a button monkey. You do impossible, amazing things every single day. And even a simple topic like how to tie your shoes from this TED Talk can be important and inspiring. Ideas, no matter how small, are worth sharing. And that brings me to the third reason behind the title of the talk. And it's that every time I come up here and I do something like this, my heart is racing. I'm pushing myself to try something new and to do something, push myself to do better. And I would strongly encourage you all to push yourself to new limits, to start a conversation, and to share your ideas. You may not realize it, but everything you do every day is important. So, on to the actual talk itself. Information is now everywhere. If you work for a large company or a publisher, somebody's going to come to you at some point with charts and numbers, and you're going to have to be able to have a conversation with them. You have to be able to understand them and talk about them intelligently in order to put them to good use. As a student or an indie dev, you're not exempt from this. All this information is also out on industry websites. You're going to get feedback from your playtests. You're going to see reports online. It's all there. And again, you need to be able to understand it in order to talk about it and to be able to implement it effectively. So my goal today is not to talk about math. I'm not talking about formulas or statistical analysis. I want to talk about actual methodology. My goal is to show you that you can use data to improve the way you build from the ground up. And the process of analytics is really, really similar to the process of level design. When you work on a project, you need to ask yourself honestly and objectively what you're building, why you're building it, and who you're building it for. And those sound like really simple questions, but if you can honestly and objectively answer them, the answers may surprise you. So, I recently came back from a trip to Disney World, and they have this new program called the Magic Band, which is this little plastic bracelet they give you with an RFID chip in it. And it has your name, your nickname, you get to pick a color, and you can decorate it and do all this stuff with it. And then they mail it to you once you've ordered it, and it comes in this cool box, and it's like this family event. It's really fun and exciting to open it. And Disney goes out of their way to really make this important to you because you wear it during your entire trip. When we got off the plane, we put on our wristbands, and then we used this band to get a shuttle to the hotel. At the hotel, we waved the band, and it registered us. We went to our hotel room. You touched the band at the door opens. It was our ticket into the park. They've even gotten rid of their fast pass system so that now you actually register online for what rides you want to go on, and then you show up and you walk right on. There's no waiting. It really is kind of magic. It's cool, right? And then after my trip, when I got home, they had sent me a photo journal that said everything I did while I was in the park and all these cool, amazing things that I did with my family. And this is when it dawned on me. I never asked them to take pictures of me. I didn't even know that they were taking pictures of me. If they had these pictures, then they knew everything. They knew when I arrived in my hotel room, when I arrived at the park, how long I was there. They know what food I ordered, where I ordered it, when I ordered it, what rides I went on, how long I was in line, and even the exact car that I was in. Can you imagine the power this gives them to customize an experience? Can you imagine the possibilities of what they could do with this kind of information? And wouldn't you like to magic band one of your games? How much would your work improve if you could better predict what your players were going to do or what they were going to enjoy? Pardon me. So, not surprisingly, this is exactly what a lot of companies are doing. Back in 2009, Google's chief economist, it's an awesome title, said that the sexiest job in the next 10 years was going to be statisticians. And sure enough, analytics has become the driving force behind mobile, free-to-play, and all these different game systems. And all of the effects of that are bleeding over into every aspect of game design. And these techniques are often considered to be dirty because they force you into these compulsion loops. They're trying to get you to spend money. But they don't have to be that way. Used properly and generously, these techniques can actually be beneficial. Our industry has grown and we've changed and we've gone beyond the point where just your gut feeling, that isn't enough to predict whether or not your game is going to be successful anymore. And it's not just about money. It's about making something that will impress, inspire, and really impact people's lives. And to me, this is the heart of level design. You create the part of the game that faces out to the player, the part that gives them that touch point to interact with whatever crazy ideas and concepts your team has come up with. Everything you do is important. So I started to dabble in analytics, and I kind of stumbled in blindly. And I thought that if I had enough information, if I could just get all these numbers and everything in front of me, I could make sense of them. But I actually ended up overwhelmed. And it was all way, way more difficult than it appeared. So, a little bit of audience participation. How many of you have ever heard of the company Trafodata? Wow, I'm actually impressed. We have someone. So Trafodata was a small company from Seattle, Washington, formed in 1972 to analyze traffic patterns. Founding members, Paul Allen and Bill Gates, would go on to combine their passion for microprocessors and software to grow their partnership into a slightly larger company that I'm sure you've heard of today. Is anyone familiar with the Homebrew Computer Club? Probably a few more, yeah. So this was Gordon French, invited some of his friends over to his house in 1975. They just decided to geek out and talk about computers for a bit. But the club grew, attracted people from all over Silicon Valley, until one day, two of its members were Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs put their heads together and decided to build something. Needless to say, their creation, the Apple computer, impressed the club and a few other billion people around the world. And I'll be impressed if anyone knows who this is. No hands, awesome. Small boy, 1982 in Potomac, Maryland, filled his parents' basement with a bunch of computers and set out to make something. He tried and tried and tried. 10 years later, he released his first shareware game called ZZT. This is Tim Sweeney. Now a young man, he didn't want people to know that he was just working out of his parents' basement. So he came up with two really big words and crammed them together to make his company, Epic Megagames. As the company grew, had a few successes along the way, and since we have been fortunate enough to grow into an international business. So, why am I talking about all this? How could you have looked at these teams and determined beforehand if they would have been a success? If you could have put a magic band on their lives, what patterns could you have found and recreated to ensure your own success? If only it were that simple, we'd all be doing it. There is no formula that can predict success. Analytics aren't magic bands. They simply don't work that way. It's not like these teams just sprouted out of Zeus's head, emerging as gods. They each had their share of both success and failure along the way. What set them apart is that they were driven by their passion to learn from those mistakes and try again. It's a great lesson, something we should all do in our lives for sure. It's also a big part of iterative design, which we've talked about a lot today, and coincidentally is the very foundation for analytics. You make a hypothesis, you gather data, and then you test. And through an understanding of the failures of that hypothesis, you form a new one, you retest, and ideally improve your outcome every time you cycle. The goal of analytics is what's called improving your probability space over time. If it were simple as looking at a bunch of numbers and reading answers, we wouldn't be having this conversation. So here is a great example. This chart shows a list of the top 25 games of 2011. It's like 18 months ago. The games with the blue popularity were all very successful games. They were good, they were profitable. The games with green in their popularity were mega hits. They were profitable on a scale 10 to 100 times that of the blue games. So the question then is, what separates the blue from the green? How do you get your game to cross over from a blue game to a green game? The simple assumption is that the green games are better games. And if that's true, their review scores should reflect that, right? Not really. It's kind of all over the board. It's not to say that quality isn't important. These were all pretty well-reviewed games. They were all fun games. But beyond a base threshold of acceptable quality, score becomes a somewhat meaningless statistic. And remember, I said it's not always just about money. You need to create a meaningful experience for your players. So rather than review score, look at how much time people spent playing these games. That's a little bit stronger of a correlation. So while baseline quality is obviously important, a more significant factor of success might be how to keep your players engaged. And again, this doesn't give you any answers. It just leads to the next question was, how do you accomplish that? And to be perfectly clear, I don't expect you to take anything away from the results of this particular study. I'm simply trying to show you that my initial assumptions, what I would actually say are pretty common assumptions, were incorrect. And as I drilled down deeper, I didn't necessarily find any answers, only more questions. I had to cycle and improve my probability space over time. Assumptions just weren't enough. But just having mountains of data isn't useful. You need to actually do something with it, right? So really we're looking at a three-step process here, and each step is a little bit more complicated than it seems. The first step is gathering and recording data. This is the information is everywhere thing that I talked about before. The second step is organizing and reading that data. And that's metrics. That's how you visualize your data. You create measurements or comparisons of that data that you've already collected. And then finally, you analyze. And this is where you come into the picture as a designer. You need to understand how to interpret all this information and then combine it with your instincts and your design insights. Data, metrics, analytics, it might seem like annoying semantics, but it's really important to understand each of the terms and their differences in order to apply them correctly. And data is really important because it's kind of the building block for all of these different pieces. And as I mentioned, data is just information, which is great as long as you really understand that that's all that it is. So let's start with this study. It's a poll to show who plays video games. Simple question. But the results of this were actually pretty surprising to me, because it skewed a lot older than I thought it would, with the largest group being college-aged, and it was more female gamers than male. Now, everyone knows that gamers are like geeky teenage boys, right? Except that this data says otherwise. So take one last look at that chart, and then let's look at the 4 most popular games in the world today. Can you guess which games they are based just off the demographics? This one is probably is the most popular game in the world right now. Note that the bulk of the players are women over 35 years old. Anyone have a guess as to what it might be? You're all on target. All right, number 2. Massively male audience, bulk of whom is around 18 years old. We're probably looking at a shooter game. Any thoughts? And note, bulk of the users are 18 years old and older. This is not necessarily a kid's game. All right, so this one, massively male audience, slightly older than Minecraft. Any thoughts on what this one might be? Call of Duty, heard League of Legends? No. This is World of Warcraft. And again, not as female as most people would generally assume. All right, last one before we move on. Massively male audience, Scream shooter, what is it? Nothing, nobody has a guess. I heard one person say Call of Duty, so I'll give it away. It is not, it is League of Legends. None of these games are shooters. The most popular games in the world are shooters played by teenage boys, right? Not at all. And then take another look. Not a single one of those matches up with the general data of who plays games. If you had used that data to inform whatever it was you were building, you would have been way off base. And here's where I melt your brain even a little bit more. Not a single one of those charts is accurate. They're all wrong. Because it's never that simple, right? All of this data is self-reported, which skews it, and it all comes from Facebook, which biases the source. And I did this to show you that data by itself is meaningless. It's just information. It has to be processed and it has to be interpreted, and it all comes down to how you decide to look at it. So data is objective and it's factual, but its tangible connection to the real world is exactly what makes it interesting and easy to misinterpret. Every map that you create is just a collection of data points. But how many times have you heard about driving the narrative of your game or using it as a means of environmental storytelling? Intentionally or otherwise, every map tells a story. This is a map of a neighborhood in Raleigh, North Carolina, where I live. It's called Boylan Heights, from a cartographer named Dennis Wood. And he uses data sets to tell stories. He says that maps exhibit and promote a political orientation. They're about something, and they have an agenda. As an example, here's another one of his maps overlaid on top of the original. And rather than houses, this one shows the distribution of power lines in that same neighborhood. Okay. And now here's a third one that shows the trees in his neighborhood. And did that switch? It did. Why didn't it switch here? There we go. All right, so individually, each of these maps is just aggregated data. But viewed together, they start to establish a narrative. It talks about urban sprawl, expansion, and encroachment. Again, maybe that's how you might interpret that narrative, and probably that's what he wants you to build as a narrative. But the reality is you can't say for sure, because data is just information. There are no answers there. Wood hasn't written anything. He hasn't made any statements, but he's used raw data to make a social commentary. So the lesson to remember here is that everything that you do in your map, even the very act of you being the one who creates it, tells a story. And that's especially true when it's viewed in context. Now, some companies like Google and Valve rely very heavily on data to drive their decision-making process. At their recent Steam Developers Days, they discussed how, like many modern companies, they monitor everything that goes through the system, everything that goes across Steam. But Valve distinguishes himself by making every bit of that data available to each and every one of their employees. And so anybody who wants to start a conversation or make an argument is actually encouraged to reference that data in support of their point, because an informed decision carries much more weight than a straight opinion. When a decision is made using data, there's less chance for a random outcome. But remember that data is only information out of context. So data should inform your decision-making process. It's the middle of the equation. But since it's only information, data alone should never make a decision for you. And this is where things get tricky, because you see data being used in the context of a social science. And in the social sciences, there are no hard and correct answers. So whenever you see data being presented in any visual format, any chart, any graph, anything like that, understand that you're seeing it through someone else's filter, often with their bias. This isn't something that people do maliciously or even intentionally. It's just human nature. Data can always tell you a story, but only if you try to interpret what that story is. So like many things in life, you have to start by asking questions. And this is where metrics come into play. And they can be absolutely useful, but you have to embrace and understand that they too are limited. Technically speaking, metrics is distance in metric space. It's just a measurement. All these charts and graphs can be very pretty and very interesting to look at, but they don't suggest change. They compare data or measure aggregates of data across different points, but it's just information for you to interpret. You need to provide that context. You need to use your design skills. And in order to get to the right answers, you need to ask the right questions. Now, the level design team at Epic uses metrics in various ways. This is one example from Gears of War Judgment that shows how the game's a couple of different levels, how their frame rate changed over time. And it's cool to see. You can see the line trends upward, which is exactly what you want, right? But once you have this kind of information, you really need to start questioning it. Does this data indicate that the map is getting better? Put the map aside for a moment. Did someone change something in the rendering pipeline? Has pathfinding been fixed? Have they fixed that quirky bug with the particle system? If you answer yes to any one of those questions, then your game and your level's frame rate is going to get up, even if the level itself is still just a huge, unpolished mess. These charts track change, but they don't say what caused that change. In order to figure out what was going on here, we had to dig and find more answers. Now here's another one that shows tracks deltas in population in our online servers, and the different colors represent different game types, and you can see here that there is a spike where people just suddenly stopped playing Execution, which was the #1 game type, and then started playing a bunch of other stuff. So what happened? Well, you can infer that that change was due to a server reboot, and you might even look, and the timestamp on that might coincide with that change in population. But it's not enough. You have to question even deeper, because there's so many other factors that could influence a change like this. What day of the week are we talking about? Was it a weekend, or were people going off to school? Was it a holiday? Was there some major news event in the world that pulled people away from gaming for a little bit? Who knows? At the end of the day, I have no idea what caused that spike. It just happened. This is a random chart I just pulled off of our servers. I can't explain it because this chart by itself isn't enough information. In all of these cases, metrics are your starting point. If you want to dive deeper, you need to account for those social science aspects of design. Get into the mind of your players and understand the reasons behind their actions. So a few years ago, I did a talk about a map called Trenches. Is anybody there for that? Yeah, a couple people. Heat map showed that players were only using one side of the map, and the other side was being completely ignored. And we figured this was some artifact of player preference or player behavior, and so we just kind of pushed things around and didn't really deal with it. And then during the beta, this map was a complete and utter failure. People stopped playing the map almost entirely. And this was entirely our fault. We forgot that heat maps are just measurements. At no point did they imply why people were in those specific locations. They simply measured how many people were there and where they were. And since it did so poorly, we decided to look at that map again after the beta, and this time we went in objectively, and sure enough, we discovered that we had trapped players in their spawns. This was not player preference. When we fixed that problem, the real problem, the map went on to become one of our most successful maps ever. Now, this is exactly why you need to ask questions that explain your metrics. You need to stay honest and objective. Sometimes you fall in love with a design because it looks cool or because, I mean, quite frankly, you built it, right? So it has to be good. When in reality, it may not be that great of a design. And when that happens, you run the risk of only seeing the data that supports your argument. This is one of the reasons that iteration and communication is so important. You need to establish your hypothesis, test, measure, and repeat. Question everything. You even need to question your questions. And what I mean by that is ask yourself why you want to know to begin with. Are you expecting a specific answer when you ask a question? If you are, then you have to be especially careful not to bias that question by leading the results to your expected answer. And this is where we failed in Trenches. We used heat maps to justify our design decisions rather than looking at it as just information leading to a solution. And then, once you do have answers, it's pretty safe to start questioning those as well. Is that answer an actionable item? Remember, your curiosity here isn't what you're important. That's not why you're doing this. Your goal should always be meaningful change. And since metrics don't provide you with answers, but what does make them special is that they help you identify the important questions. And questions are what force you to be objective, to think outside the box and look at your work from a unique perspective. And the why is the most important thing you can ask. Why was the frame rate low in those charts? Why did the population numbers fall? Why were players on only one side of the map? And the most important why of all, and I can't stress this enough, is to ask yourself, why do you want to know the answer? So in the Trenches map, we failed to ask why. We were looking for answers that justified our assumptions without even really understanding what the hell it was we were looking for. But we did learn a valuable lesson. And when a similar problem popped up in a different map, we handled it quite differently. This is Academy, which was from a later Gears DLC, and it had this round area in the middle of the map that was elevated with very tight and controllable entrances, and lots of cover leading up to those entrances. And of course, heat maps showed an incredible accumulation of movement and death all in this one spot, while the rest of the map was being ignored. Sound familiar? So we wanted to figure out why. We had some ideas, but rather than just assuming we knew what the problem was, we approached it objectively. We looked at how players were dying, not just where they were in cover, and why they were there to begin with. And what we were able to determine was that teams would charge into this area to get the boom shot, which is arguably the most powerful weapon in any Gears game. And then they would just camp there. And as they camped there, more and more people would run up there, and since they had the most powerful weapon in the game, they would kill them over and over and over. So why would you ever leave, right? You had the power spot in the map. So to fix it, we moved the boom shot to the far opposite end of the map. And then we continued to test, and we saw a dramatic shift in player movement away from this one area. The new results fell much more in line with what we expected and hoped to see. We were able to say, hey, this was a fixed problem, and it was high fives all around. Until people started dying in the spot where we moved the boom shot to. All of this data was telling us was that everywhere we put the boom shot, people were going to die. And this is exactly where our previous lesson came into play. Question everything. Ask why. Why were players dying in this spot? Remember, once you have your hypothesis, you need to test it, find the failures, and then formulate a new hypothesis based on the current results. Just because the answer to the previous why was people were dying because of the boom shot, that didn't mean it was the same answer to this question right now. So we set all that boom shot data aside and we started from scratch. And here's a screenshot of that same area from a slightly different camera angle. And it turns out that people were abusing their over-the-camera shoulder and had a line-of-sight advantage right by that arrow. So we didn't know at first why that happened. So we went back and looked, and all of our previous testing had been done when the map was an undecorated shell. And if you watch right by where the arrow is, you'll see that the walls in that version were significantly higher. And so when the map was decorated and those walls were inadvertently lowered, it opened up a line of sight that didn't previously exist. So we simply just filled that space back in. The more we tested, sure enough, everything fell into line. Heat maps started to show a nice distribution of deaths all across the map, and everything was golden. We knew, based off of what we had in Trenches, that we had to look at these as two separate problems. There was a correlation to the boom shot moving, but there was no causation. You have to resist the urge to be satisfied with the status quo and always remember to question everything. All right, so data is information, metrics are measurements, comparisons of that information. Analytics, and this is the meat of the thing, are used to interpret that information. And analytics and metrics are very often confused, but they have some very, very distinct differences. Metrics is math-based. It's hard science versus analytics, which, and this is a little bit controversial to some people, is a social science. That doesn't necessarily imply a real true answer. It's something that you have to interpret or infer into the future versus metrics, which is a measurement of past data. Really, analytics has two functions. First, you use data analysis to gain insight. And the goal there is to separate fact from opinion. Everyone has opinions, and so it can be impossible to ever decide when you have two conflicting opinions which one is right. And opinions lead to argument, and that can create unresolvable conflict. So in order to prevent yourself from just aimlessly spinning on and on forever, you need to look at the facts and see how they relate to the team's common goal. It makes sense. If you don't have a finish line, you're never going to get there. If you don't have a starting point and a finish line, then there's nothing to measure. So before you start anything, outline your goals and define your success state. The purpose of analytics isn't just to impress people with pretty charts and mountains of numbers. You need to separate facts from opinions and then use those facts to help you understand what's going on in your maps. And this is the second major function of analytics, using those facts to guide decision making. If your goals are outlined before you start, then they can be used to inform your process rather than the result. This makes you proactive rather than reactionary. Go back to the beginning of my talk, and what were the three things I wanted to talk about? Ask what you're building, why you're building it, and who you're building it for. Those answers define your goals. And if you stick to them, you can tell when change in your map is actually going to be something meaningful rather than just decorative. Outlining your goals helps keep you focused. There's less chance you'll be distracted by misleading information. You have to be especially careful of really good presentations because visualization can be very important, but remember those maps of the Boylan Heights neighborhood? The visualization didn't necessarily explain anything at all. Analytics is all about patterns, and our brains love patterns. We have this kind of inherent need to explain patterns. So you see a pie chart, and your brain veers off to thoughts, Pac-Man, and you end up chasing ghosts. Charts can mislead you to believe that false information is real, like seeing deaths due to boomshot in Academy, when really there is no deaths due to boomshot in Academy. Or think about those player charts that I showed you in the very beginning of the talk, and how if you had used them to inform your design process, you would have been so far off base. This is why some people call data visualization a halfway house. It's that middle point. It's the stopping point from data to decision. And remember my STEAM slide, there it is right in the middle. It isn't answers, it helps analytics help guide you toward a decision. All right, and this is exactly where you come into the picture designer. Take all those pretty charts and all that information and fold it into your knowledge and your design sensibilities. By combining your instincts with data, you go beyond functional solutions into something that can become emotionally resonant, that enables your players to make those connections with your game, with your level, and with your work. This is how you ask or how you answer what, why, and who. And this is a very specific skill set that distinguishes a designer on the team from everybody else who contributes to design by offering their opinions. Everyone has opinions and ideas, but not everyone understands the importance of how and when to actually make changes and how to make that change meaningful. Does anyone use Spotify or Pandora? Cool. See, most of you know what they are. They use algorithms to predict what music you might like to listen to based off your basic listening patterns. And for the most part, they are pretty accurate. But to make a playlist that's really good, one that I really care about, still requires human input into the process. You have to go through and thumb up and thumb down those songs to get beyond just a list of computer-generated suggestions. Data only gets them halfway there. It still requires that human input to get from predictive to meaningful. Now, Netflix has a similar system on television and movies, but they've taken it one step further. Again, data can't tell them how to make a TV show, but they think it can tell them what they should be making. And when they created House of Cards, they weren't just guessing at what people wanted. They were analyzing patterns in their database. So what do those patterns reveal? The Perry Mason effect. What would you guess is the most popular show streaming across Netflix? Perry Mason. Who are the most popular actors on everything viewed on Netflix? The actors from Perry Mason. Okay, let's get abstract. If you look at just the themes of the shows across all the shows that are being streamed on Netflix, what comes up as the top list of themes? Those viewed in Perry Mason. All the data that they had suggested that they should be remaking Perry Mason. So why did they make House of Cards? As an individual data point, Perry Mason is meaningless. Netflix calls this a ghost in the machine. It's a byproduct of complexity. In slightly more technical terms, as you increase the number of variables that you're measuring, you increase the odds of a false positive result. In any system, there's always the chance that some of your results will come back as being statistically significant, even if they're totally fake or wrong. Someone, at some point, is always going to camp at that boomshot location in Academy. That's just human nature. And anyone could suggest a change to make them move. But it's the designer's job to question why they were camping there. Why did Perry Mason show up? Because that was a playlist generated by algorithm, with no one to thumb it up or down. I can look at any Call of Duty map or any popular map from any game, deconstruct the technical aspects of it, go through everything in there, and then recreate it. But is my new version going to be a success? Is it going to be emotionally resonant? Or is it just going to be a copycat? If you're looking at a bunch of data, then probably so is everyone else. If you use that data, they're going to as well. And you're probably going to end up with really similar results. You're going to make a copycat. You're going to go and you're going to make Perry Mason. And remember, that key component is the human touch. And that's Netflix's secret, one that they guard very closely. What human influence do they put on their data? How is it interpreted? How did they get from Perry Mason to House of Cards? I don't know. They won't say. One can assume that they followed the logical associations of character archetypes and themes and things like that. But the specifics of that process, how they combine their data with their instincts, is part of the secret sauce that makes them special. And this is the same design instinct that makes you special too. You can use data to inform your process, but don't let it lead you blindly into a decision, or you'll just end up making another copycat. You'll make the same level as everyone else over and over. So throughout the history of the Gears franchise, we struggled with balancing our shotgun. Every single time we looked at the stats, the Gnasher was at the top, sometimes responsible for as much as 90% of all kills in a given month. That's broken. So we tried to fix it. And every time we tried to fix it, we messed it up. Our player base kept yelling at us. They kept getting upset, saying we just didn't understand. But we continued to watch the data, and we shared everything with them. We made these big presentations like this one that tried to explain the changes we were making, and we buried them and ourselves under mountains and mountains of data. We did range, we did kill counts, we did damage values, we analyzed the pellet distribution patterns, we did everything. But we never added that human touch. We never stopped to ask why people were using the shotgun in the first place. We had no end goal, no idea of what a fixed shotgun would actually look like. And as it turns out, the Gnasher wasn't broken. There was this huge passion for how it felt to move through the map with the Gnasher at your side. Firing the gun was fun, the effects and the sounds were satisfying, connecting with it was totally empowering. Using the Gnasher was a hugely successful and rewarding experience. From a design perspective, it was achieving every goal that we were striving for. It was meaningful. It was all the other weapons that were completely deficient. And it wasn't until the third game in the series that I think we really started to realize this and truly appreciate what was going on. This was our Ghost in the Machine. We had all the information in the world about the Gnasher and tons of really pretty charts and graphs to look at, but we were attached to them, and they prevented us from seeing the real problems because we had all these cool-looking charts, and there was so much information there that we couldn't get through it. We saw a problem in weapon balance, but we had no idea the solution that we were looking for. There was no defined state of success. So in Gears of War Judgment, we were finally able to address this in what I think was a meaningful way. And with all of our weapons balanced equally, we toyed with the idea of giving everyone one single base weapon to start with, the Lancer rifle, and nothing else. All of the other weapons, including the Gnasher, were scattered throughout the map as pickups. And because each weapon was now equally worthwhile, they were all worth searching for. And this gave the game a little bit more of an old-school shooter feel, which is great. But at the end of the day, we wanted to give our players more choice. We wanted them to have some customization and personalization. So we decided to move to kind of a more modern-feeling loadout model. Knowing our players' affinity for the Gnasher, it was being used as a lure in that original model, so that we had shotguns scattered all over the map, and people would go to all four corners, and you can see a nice, even distribution of play. After we changed to the loadout system, our players immediately fell back into patterns of camping that plagued all the previous iterations of Gears. Now, our heat map showed people moving and dying in these tight, collected groups. And we started to question, if we had really addressed those problems in weapon balance, why was this happening? Well, in contrast to our previous games, Judgment maps were all asymmetrical. Rather than a single individual front that pulled players to a common ground, every point in the map had to be a defensible front. And since players were now starting with their favorite weapon, the Gnasher, and they could use it effectively everywhere, why would you ever leave? Why not just spawn, wait for somebody to run up to you and shoot them in the face? You didn't have to go anywhere. This is exactly what they did. They all started camping. This was, of course, a fixable problem, and it led to some overhaul on a few of our maps. This is the overhead from a map called Gondola, if you're at all familiar with this series. And we had to add some extra access points to the top of the map and open up this kind of highly defensible side area because those two areas were really easy to camp. Of course, this also meant that we had to rearrange our weapon loadouts, add some extra escape paths down from the bottom, rework some approaches, move a couple walls to accommodate other changes, open up lines of sight, on and on. It was this endless cascade of issues that we were completely unprepared for. And this was only one map. Just like data without context, change without defined purpose is meaningless. It can only lead to churn, wasting time and resources. We rebalanced all of the other weapons in the game to accommodate the shotgun. And then changing to the loadout model was just one more small change in the system. But we were never able to address all the other problems that it created down the road. And the game always felt imbalanced and off as a result of that. Now, there's no question that our goal was absolutely to improve our players' experience. But how do you define what that actually is? There's no end. There's no measurable result there. There was no tangible goal and no understanding of the complexity of all the other systems that were involved in this process. We didn't address what we were building, we didn't address why we were making the change, and we didn't address who we were making those changes for. We changed just for the sake of change, and we ended up churning for months. And remember, no problem is ever like this is ever really 100% fixed. When we moved that Boomshot and Academy, we didn't solve the problem. We created a new hypothesis, that players would move away from that area, and we found that the new data supported our new hypothesis. Statistically speaking, we saw that players were, on average, moving away from that area instead of camping it. Theoretically speaking, we could continue to test forever. Get more information every time you do it, right? You refine your hypothesis, you improve your probability space. It's not like that data is ever going to get old or be thrown away, it just piles up. But the reality is that at some point you do need to stop. You have a schedule, you have a budget, and you have all these other things that need prioritization. And in complicated systems, like a multiplayer game, there's always the chance that the results of your next playtest are going to reveal a new Ghost in the Machine. So at some point, you need to stop. You need to accept that you know the best that you can know right now and move on. In order to avoid churn, in order to keep from chasing ghosts, you need to outline your goals, outline your goals and define success from the start. All right, cool stories, bro. What do I do with all this information? Good design is very often about simplification, streamlining, and clarification. I look at analytics as a mindset that helps me focus on those principles and use them to inform the decisions that I make every single day. Continuing to ask why strengthens the impact and validity of every decision that we make. It helps focus on what you're building and how you should approach it, and this helps us to define our goals. And once change is made, it can be quantified and measured. This separates opinions from information and leads to meaningful change in your maps. And remember, there are no guarantees. One of the most famous sayings in Hollywood comes from screenwriter William Goldman, who says, "Nobody knows anything." Not one person in the entire motion picture field knows for certainty what's going to work. Every time out, it's a guess. This is why people passed on Raiders of the Lost Ark, and Star Wars, and Harry Potter, and the Twilight series, all predicting their inevitable failure. Failures just like those goofy kids that started Microsoft, and Apple, and Epic Games. But reality is games do fail every day. It's bound to happen. Temple Run was this huge success right out of the gates. But you have to remember that they were an anomaly. It's more telling that Rovio had 56 other games before Angry Birds, and that Candy Crush, the #1 game in the world, was more than 150th in King's roster. So it's really easy to look back and say, yeah, this is what we did right, or that's what they did right. But it's even harder to look forward and predict this is what we should be doing, because there are no guarantees. But analytics can improve your chances for success. They help you both understand your players and the content that those players are consuming, the content you are building for your players. The better you understand your own maps, the better you can predict the way people will interact with them, and the better you'll be able to innovate and come up with new and interesting and meaningful surprises. The cycle of innovation and experimentation is how you magic band your maps. Experimentation is the foundation for analytics in the same way that iteration is the foundation for design. This is Six Sigma. It's an analytical model that was designed for the manufacturing industry. It's this weird process that requires like training and certification, and I don't have any of it. But when I saw this, it struck me how similar the methodology is to level design. Start at the top right and look at the defined state. What are you building? Why are you building it? Who are you building it for? Does it support a game system or the narrative? What are your goals? What are you trying to achieve? Outline your goals and define your success. And then go on to measure. With a clear outlining of your goals, you can define your starting point. If you know where you are now, you can measure where you're going to be later. This is metrics. Maybe you're introducing a new weapon and you want to track success. Maybe there's some important visualization or visual element like a tower, and you want to use heat maps to track where and when people are getting there. Just remember that once you have this data, it still needs to be interpreted and analyzed. Data is information. It is not answers. So then you analyze. Cover your bases. Don't just accept that first answer that pops up. Maybe players are dying frequently around a powerful weapon. But maybe there's other factors like map geometry. Separate correlation and causation. One of the biggest lessons I've learned as a designer is that if I need to repeatedly defend a design decision with my team, with my players, it's probably a bad decision. And that's especially true if the data that or the information that I'm using to support that decision is pure statistics. There's always going to be people who don't immediately get a change that you make or a design decision that you make. But if they don't get it quickly through testing and iteration, you need to step back and ask why. What part of your design isn't being communicated? Question everything. Analytics don't give you answers, but they do improve your chances for success. You are the one who adds that human element. This is where we get to improve. This is your moment to shine. This is your role as an LD. Anyone can look at those data and read the numbers, but it's the designer's job to know how and when to incorporate that data to make a change that results in meaningful impact. And then finally, control. Understand that every change you make has consequences. Systems are complicated. Change one system and it affects another. Always ask, what's the bigger impact of this small change? What's the goal of that change? Nothing is simple. Every change matters. And you're going to mess it up. But that's okay. That's part of the process. Be honest about it and learn from your mistakes. When you fail at something, go back, redefine, retest. This is exactly why this process is a continuous loop. You identify a question. You develop a hypothesis. You test, you measure, and you repeat. This is iteration. Every time the loop repeats, your chances of success get a little better. You improve your probability space. So much of science is about patterns. And as I've mentioned, analytics is about discovering those patterns. But there's patterns in non-science areas as well. Look at pop culture. A few years ago, we had shooter after shooter coming to the market, and everyone was fighting this endless stream of World War II battles. Kill Nazis, kill Nazis, kill Nazis, until modern warfare showed up. And it changed the context to something that was suddenly culturally relevant. They mixed in some RPG elements and did some other things, but that setting made sense to the current pop culture patterns. They broke that copycat mold by innovating. They shifted the paradigm of the entire industry. And how did people react? Well, they started making modern warfare, modern warfare, modern warfare. It's early, but I feel pretty safe in saying that the same guys are going to break that pattern again with Titanfall. They understand the importance of innovation, the human element of setting the bar and achieving goals. They know what they're building, they know why they're building it, and they really know who they're building it for. They understand the importance of everything, and this is your challenge. If there's one thing I want you to take away from today, it's that analytics can guide you toward a true understanding of your game and your players. It's not about the math, it's about asking the right questions and knowing when and how to mix in your own personal instincts and insights. Create meaningful change for your players. Understand not just who they are, but how and why they play. Not to milk them for money, but to help you create an experience that they deem is worth the time and investment of their attention. Their experience is in your hands, and everything that you do is important. Thank you.